This is a race card for March 15th, 1921, the second day of a 2-day Hawthorn Hill meeting. The simple reason for releasing this video today is that it's the 100th anniversary of this meeting. For this background on Hawthorn Hill Racecourse, I used Chris Pitt's book A Long Time Gone, one of 4 volumes of Don Sousa's book Racecourses Here Today and Gone Tomorrow. Hawthorn Hill Racecourse had its first meeting on the 16th of April 1888 and its last on the 4th of April 1939. The main driving force behind its creation was Mr. F. Headington. The farm belonged to Sir Robert Wilmot, whose daughter Nora Wilmot was the first woman to train a winner under her own name, and I'll explain about ludicrous sexism of the Jockey Club in a forthcoming video about the former Alexandra Park Racecourse. Hawthorn Hill appears to have been a picturesque and popular racecourse with its patrons. The course was closed during World War I and reopened in March 1920. After World War II, there was pony racing for a few years, but it's now a golf course. Although this picture, which I have as a postcard, shows what it looked like before the redevelopment but after the racing stopped. It's also interesting to link our post where a formed discussion from local people about the racecourse gives information about it after it closed. Coincidentally, Hawthorn Hill is also a name of a horse who ran at the old Baldoyle Racecourse in Ireland the next day after the meeting I'm looking at. I assume that the Lord Stanley, who is a steward here, is Edward Stanley, the 17th Earl of Derby, who owned the winners of all 5 classics at least twice, and include a Wikipedia link to his extensive racing and non-racing life. I've already mentioned his fellow steward Sir Robert Wilmot. Arthur Yates may be the successful former jockey and trainer. Although it is him, he'd been in his late 70s and died the next year. As I say in a number of his videos, any horse who looks like it's pronounced Familiar the second there, as you can see that horse there, is actually Familiar, and all it denotes is this second horse called Familiar, and the same if it was Familiar the third, fourth, fifth, or any other number. Bruno won this race and was owned and trained at this point by Mr. M.B. Saville. M.B. Saville may be the same M.B. Saville who was a jockey at some level earlier in the century. That jockey was spectating at a Kent point-to-point meeting in May 1905 and horsed through its jockey before the race, and helped the jockey and made sure he was okay. He offered to take over the ride as his fellow rider was injured. Just riding his work clothes, he managed to finish a close second. There was an M.B. Saville who was a Kent League cricketer at the same time, so it was probably the same person given the Kent connection. After a seller, J. Brown bought him for what is probably 100 guineas. Unfortunately, Wolf's guide has a slightly uncertain figure between the 1 and the 0. The jockey was Costello, who I assume was Thomas Costello, but I know nothing more about him than that. Even Jockeypedia don't have any information about him. Bruno never ran on the flat. Wolf's guide for the spring of 1920 covers all of 1919 plus the spring of 1920. As he ran in both 1919 and 1920, the index rather confusingly lists him twice, once as a 5-year-old for 1919 and as a 6-year-old for 1920. Bruno was placed in a beginner's hurdle at Plumpton on December 17, 1919, having been a non-runner at Lingford earlier. He was trained by Mr. M. Walford of the Palmar Gazette and once mistakenly called him Watford. Bruno ran 5 times in 1920. In January, he refused at first at Folkestone. He was second at Gatwick in March, and in what the Scotsman newspaper described as a chapter of accidents, 4 of the 5 runners either fell and refused, and in this Bruno case, he did both in turn. Allegedly, before the 1980 Grand National, trainer Captain Tim Foster told American jockey Charlie Fenwick to keep remounting winner Ben Nevis, although that wasn't necessary in the end. In the case of Bruno's jockey Captain Bennett, he did do that and somehow finished second. Bruno then won a selling handicap chase at 5-4 at the former Rye Racecourse in East Kent. His connections brought him back after a race for 180 guineas. In May, he was second at the former Isle of Wight Racecourse. In 1921, Bruno ran 8 times, but today's card was his only win. He was second at Gatwick in January and third at Plumpton the same month, and also third at the old Folkestone Racecourse in Kent in March. He lost a match race at Seville in September by 20 lengths and was second in a 3-runner race at Wetherby in October. In 1922, he won 4 times, his only placed effort being third at the old Brocklesby Racecourse in Lincolnshire in April. He won 3 times in 1923. He was second at 2 former racecourses in April, first at Tarpley Racecourse in Cheshire, and then at Bridgnorth in Somerset. A remarkable turn of form in 1924, he won 5 of his 10 races that year. At this point he is owned by Mr. Colling at some point that year, and also later on owned by Bill Whitbread. Colonel Whitbread, as he became at some point, was a well-known owner in the 20th century. As part of the Whitbread brewing family, he was also responsible for the company having the first ever sports sponsorship in the UK, with the Whitbread Gold Cup at Sandown running from 1957 until 2001, until Bet365 took over sponsorship. In April, Bruno won at the old Bungay racecourse in Suffolk. Later in the month he was emplaced in a point-to-point at the Newmarket and Furlough Hunt. The next few races are more tricky, as, because I assume a printer's error, part of the results of the spring 1925 version of Rough's Guide have the chase results in the wrong order, and 2 of 3 numbers in the index for Bruno actually relate to flat racing, and the other to Ireland, and he ran in none of those races anyway. One of the 2 missing results relates to where he finished 3rd at a course, possibly Hefferset, where he had been declared to run in May, and the second does relate to Southwell, where he won in June. The 3rd race has him finishing 3rd at a course, but I'm afraid I don't know which one that is. Bruno won back in Bungay in September, then won a national flats race at Perth later in September, 2 days after being unplaced in a chase at the same course. He won at the Old Monmouth course in Wales in October by the simple fact he was the only runner. In December, Sporting Times said Bill Whitbread was very hopeful of him winning the amateur chase at Hurstbach and Bruno, not hopeful enough though, as Bruno didn't run on that day. He had 3 unplaced efforts in 1925 and now was ridden by Bill Whitbread himself in the hunter chase at the old Rye racecourse, where Mr. Gosden also rode, who could be a very young Towser Gosden, the father of current trainer John Gosden. Bruno only won twice in 1926, and in a bizarre situation, these were the first and the last race on the Wincanton card on October the 13th, where the 12-year-old was now owned by a Mr. V. Hunt, and he wasn't placed in either, so to be frank, Bruno couldn't land a blow in either race. The last time a horse won in 2 races on the same day in British racing was Amington Girl on the 22nd of May 1999 at Wolverhampton, and I believe the rules prohibit it now. Horse named Andrew Lang, listed there, is probably named after a former Scottish poet, novelist and anthropologist. Dunshire won this race, and the Dunshire was a flat cap worn by workers at Harland and Wolff Shipyard in Belfast. Dunshire's owner was Mr. T. Bartlett, and was trained by Captain Percival Ayton Onley Whittaker. His jockey was A. Gregson, who was probably the same one with that name, who replaced the injured 50-year-old champion jockey and aforementioned Percy Whittaker on rather dark in the 1921 Grand National, and Gregson rode for Percy Whittaker in this period. In 1923, the Sheffield Daily Telegraph called him the well-known steeplechase rider. That year he was due to box flat race jockey Jack Evans, for fun for the family of jockey Clyde Ayling, who had been tragically killed after falling in December 1922, having been leading the Champions Jockeys race. Roscoe mentioned that Whittaker bought Dunshire back for 280 guineas after he won this seller. Dunshire also never won on the flat. He made his national debut at the old Birmingham racecourse in January 11, 1921 in a maiden hurdle when he was unplaced. After finishing last at the former Derby racecourse the next month, he won on today's card, and then in May he won at the former Newport racecourse in Wales. I assume Dunshire was injured, as he didn't run for 19 months until unplaced at Windsor in December 1922. However, in 1923 he was very busy and also very successful, winning 5 of his 11 races. He won at Windsor in January, with Whittaker now his owner as well as trainer. The meeting was nearly cancelled as there was a thick fog in the morning, but the wind and the sun cleared it. There was more drama after the race, as there was an objection to Dunshire crossing another horse, but it was overruled. The stewards, to make matters worse for the runners-up connections, kept the £5 deposit paid for the objection. The ferret in the Dundee Courier said, "One is becoming wary of these frivolous objections by jockeys." After the race he was bought by Mrs. C. Stevens for 100 guineas. He also won at Newbury in February. Fortune Tass, writing in the Sheffield Daily Telegraph, said Dunshire had been ignored in the market and had won after an interesting finish. The Pall Mall Gazette said he'd won cleverly. He was sold to Mrs. M. S. Russell for 240 guineas and was now trained by Mr. Bailey. Mrs. Russell is probably Matilda Spearing Russell, born in Belfast, and her husband, who at some point trained the horse, would have been Bartholomew Campbell Russell, born in Dublin, and maybe the same B. Campbell Russell, who was at the Officers Training Corps, Army Service Corps, Aldershot 1916 in World War I. Dunshire also won at Uttoxeter and Sandown in April on what is now the Bet 365 Gold Cup Day. As I said, that used to be the Whitbread Gold Cup, ridden by Major Doyle. Pall Mall Gazette wrote of a crowd size held up despite it being the day of the FA Cup final, and Dunshire was retained by the Russells again for a figure of 280 guineas. Major Doyle's day got worse though, as he dislocated his shoulder later in the fall and had a possible broken arm. Dunshire won at Uttoxeter in October, and later in October he was third at Nottingham when that course still had jumps racing, and fourth at Sandown in December. Westminster Gazette strongly fancied him at the Old Hurst Park racecourse in early January 1924, but he didn't win. The Daily Mirror fancied him at Lingfield around the same time, but he was well beaten. Also in January, Dunshire was narrowly beaten into second place at Leicester and was now owned by Captain B. Brady. The Belfast Newsletter felt he lost that race due to swerving close home. Dunshire won a Stayers Handicap hurdle in February after being well backed at the old Derby racecourse, but there was immediate objection from the connections on the runner-up, or what the newspaper called technical grounds, but were quickly found to be an actual allegation that the horse was managed by a disqualified person. Just over a week later, after a lengthy discussion, the appeal was upheld and the runner-up got the race. And the massive irony, the new winner was called Murky Past. It's not clear whether the disqualified person was Captain Brady himself, but although given he owned the horse later in the year, I think it's doubtful. Dunshire didn't win after 1924. The horse Valentine Mayer may be named after former 19th century Irish Whig politician. Alcazar won the 1924 Aintree Champion Chase. It had been the probable favourite for the inaugural Cheltenham Gold Cup that year, but was pulled out on the morning due to a mixture of a temperature and slight coughing. Muscoff won this race, and was owned and trained by Mr. A.C. Saunders. His jockey was T. Hume, who I assume was Tom Hume, who rode in the Grand National a number of times, including finishing fourth. He'd also been paid £50 for winning on a winger the year before called Silver Badge. However, it looks like he was an innocent party in the scam. Mascoff made his racing debut at the old Tuam racecourse in Ireland on the 29th of August 1911. Tuam only used to hold one meeting a year and was always held as the fourth day of the Galway Festival until 1973 when Tuam closed. Mascoff won a flat race on this day in what appears to be his only race on the flat. In October he was due to run the plate at Down Royal when owned by P. Wardiers and trained by Arnott, but he didn't run. In 1912 he was trained by Percy Whittaker, who I just mentioned in relation to Dunshire, and owned by Colonel William Hall Walker. Hall Walker's father has the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool named after him. The junior Hall Walker is best known for gifting his Irish stud and bloodstock a few years later to a British state, who still won all of Ireland, with intention of a British stud being created. In 1943 the Irish government bought the land and created the Irish National Stud. Bizarrely, Colonel Hall Walker used horoscopes for breeding. And the Irish National Stud is a beautiful place to visit if you're in the Kildare area, and includes a lovely Japanese garden, as that was one of Hall Walker's other interests. I visited there when I was at the Coa for a 2-day Irish Derby meeting in 2017, and the racecourse is nearby. The stud includes national hunt legends such as Hardy Eustace and Hurricane Fly. Beef or salmon wandered over to me when I was there, only to go away again when he realised I didn't have a carrot. In January 1912, Mascoff was third at the Old Hurst Park course in a novice chase in heavy ground. He then won a maiden chase at the same course in February, and was third in beginner's chase at Ludlow the same month. In March he was second at Windsor in a maiden chase when that course still had jumps racing. In those days the race was called Maidens at Closing, which meant when we entered the maiden you were a maiden, you could actually enter the race, and it can be a bit confusing seeing horses win maiden races having already won a race, but that's how it worked in those days. In March he was second back at Hurst Park, where Fortunatus, writing in the Sheffield Daily Telegraph, said he had been disappointing. Mascoff then won a 2-runner race at Wincanton in April, which was his only other run in any of 1912. He was supposed to be running in a handicap chase your Derby course in December, only to be a non-runner. But these were actually bizarre circumstances, as his rider Frank Titch Mason missed his train. He was a top quality jockey who won many races including the Grand National, and his ashes are buried at Aintree. In January 1913, Mascot fell at the first fence at Hurst Park, and Ditch Mason probably wished he'd missed his train again, as Magpie, writing in the Globe, said Tish nearly broke his neck in the fall. Mascot was third at the Old Derby course in February, where he failed to realise anticipations, according to a Western Mail correspondent. He won at Leicester in March, only 3 days after finishing third in a 4-1 race at Hurst Park. This win was down in grade, according to the Scotsman. The Sheffield Daily Telegraph correspondent wrote that Mascot had lost in Hurst Park on Friday due to a bad mistake, and this winning race was run at a slower pace. Later in March he was second at Wincanton, and in April he won back at Tarpley Hunt Racecourse before falling the next day in the Stanley Chase over national fences at Aintree, which in those days was still called Liverpool. Papers disagree whether Mascot fell at Beeches or the fence before. The Stanley Chase was a novice chase, and John Randall, writing the Racing Post, said it was usual for the whole field to fall with the winner remounted. 2 of 11 runners finished in 1913, and looks like thankfully neither needed remounting. I'm surprised the race lasted in the calendar as long as 1952. Later in April he won at the old Whetford Hunt Racecourse in Nottinghamshire. In May he was third in the National Flat Race at the old Cardiff Racecourse, and in November he was second at Newbury, where scrimmaging at the last hurdle may have cost Mascot the race, according to the Scotsman newspaper, and in December he won an amateur chase at the old Gatwick Racecourse, where Sheffield Daily Telegraph said there were loud cheers when he won as favourite. And in December the 30th at Newbury he blew his chance of a fall at the final fence. 1914 started the year with a third at Plumpton in February and was third again in March, this time a grand annual handicap chase at Cheltenham Festival, a race which is still run nowadays at the festival. In April he won a chase at Ludlow, and later in the year he won at Cheltenham in November. He was second at Birmingham in December before winning later at month at Gatwick. Mascot also won in December at the former Houghton Park Racecourse in Cheshire. Rapier, in the Illustrating Sporting and Dramatic News, suggested that a sizable crowd at Gatwick did not look like there'd be much good in the ranks, and may as well have gone racing, of course referring to the First World War. George Parfumon rode him on occasions around now. It was a Belgian-born champion French national hunt jockey. He was Whittaker's first choice jockey in Britain when World War I broke out, and Parfumon joined the army later in the war. In February 1915, Mascot was third at Windsor, with Manchester Courier described him as a false favourite. Later in February he was third at Kempton, and also in the same place, third at Houghton Park in March. In May, won at Uttoxeter. Mascot was put up for sale by Whittaker in June, but failed to meet his reserve price. However, it may have been a private sale, as later in the year he was owned by today's owner, Mr. A.C. Saunders. I don't believe he won in 1916, possibly because of injury, but also World War I decreased the amount of racing taking place. In February 1917, Mascot was a well-beaten second in the Lingfield Chase and was second in the chase at Gatwick in March. He is now trained by Sir Robert Wilmot. Later in March he won 2 days in a row at Hawthorn Hill. Firstly, a selling chase where Saunders retained him for 80 guineas, and secondly, a handicap chase, as I said, the next day, January. In 1918, he was second in the Winter Handicap Chase, and in 1919, second at Sandown in January on heavy going, before winning at Windsor 2 days later on what Ruff's Guide intriguingly calls frosty going. In third place was the 1915 Grand National winner Ali Sloper. Later in the year, Mascot won 3 successive races. In April, he won at Ludlow. In May he won at Sandown, and then he won the Grand Annual Handicap Chase at Cheltenham the same month. Now why that was run in May and not March is because there was no Cheltenham Festival between 1916 and 1919, but in 1919 a 2-day meeting was held in May as some sort of replacement festival. Mascot was third at Sandown in October that year, but didn't run May because of injury in 1920. January 17th, 1921, he was 66-1 anti-post in the Grand National market, but didn't win the race in the end. In February, he was third at Leicester. Aside from winning on today's card, he finished third in Rice Grand National, which in those days was held at the former Cardiff Racecourse, and also in those days held in March. In 1922, he had 7 runs, but his only placed efforts were second at Newbury in November and in December. After the November race, White Knight, writing in Leeds Mercury, said that King's Court had worried Mascot out of the race, and Saunders had bought the winner of that race for 120 guineas. Mascot had 8 runs that year. It's amazing for a horse who was now 15 years old. He finished second at Windsor and then third at Kempton on heavy ground, and both of these were in January. He then fell twice in a row, the first of these in February at Lingfield, where he was 6-4 favourite despite still his age of 15 years old. The ground had been so heavy that the race had been delayed a day. It was second at Hawthorn Hill in March, back at this meeting and game we're looking at now. The next month he gained his final career win in the Farmers' Race during the Farmers' Brigade meeting at Hawthorn Hill. Where the sportsman called him another old warrior. Saunders rode the horse himself, and was less interested than the day before. The Prince of Wales, as the future Edward VIII, had rode a winner in front of King George V and Queen Mary. Now Edward VIII had rode quite a lot of horses in those days, had a habit of falling off, and eventually was advised, really, that the heir to the throne, he was taking too many risks and stopped riding, and actually, sadly, really, lost interest in horse racing. Although, given what happened to him in the monarchy, maybe having something happen to him may not have been a bad idea. Certainly maybe better what happened afterwards. And Mascot was unplaced in his final two career runs of that season. Oilcloth won this race and was owned by Mr. F.R. Fry. His trainer was Ted Grout, who trained the winner of the 1937 champion hurdle, and he had a future champion jump jockey Jack Dowsdwell as an apprentice, and a couple of articles say how much Dowsdwell despised his treatment by Grout. The jockey was W. Burley, who may be William Henry Joseph Burley, who was tragically killed in 1929 when a horse who was schooling threw him off and trampled him. Oilcloth only appears to have run 3 times in his career, all of which were in 1921. He was fourth in his debut at Newby on February 24th, then he won on this card looking at today at Hawthorn Hill, and afterwards was third of the former Cardiff racecourse also in March, and that appears to be it. There was a possibility for Lingfield and Uttoxeter early in May, but didn't run in either. The horse Chancellor, as well as later on the race card Ram's Head and Larch Hill, are actually declared in 2 races, and this is much more common before overnight declarances came in March 1961, as we wouldn't know which horse was running in which race until then, and sometimes they didn't even run in either race anyway. Spuig is listed here, and 6 years later he won the 1927 Grand National. The Pleiades listed here is almost certainly named after the open star cluster of the same name, commonly also known as the Seven Sisters and sometimes as Messier 45. Warner won this race and is owned by Mrs. Croft, who is probably the wife of Colonel Croft, who owns the winner of the next race on the card. It was trained by Usher, and that's all that's ever said, although sometimes it may come up as H. Usher, which isn't actually any more help, as there's only 3 Ushers who appear to be training horses around now, and all are H. Usher. They are H. H. Usher, H. J. Usher, and Henry Ingham Usher, known as Harry Usher. Mrs. Croft and Colonel Croft separately owned a Galway Plate winner trained by Harry Usher, so I assume that Morn is trained by Harry Usher. Harry Usher rode and trained a few winners at the Cheltenham Festival, and the jockey was R. Trudgill, who was in his rod at Trudgill, and I link his Wikipedia page that details his remarkable win of a 1924 Grand National, which happened obviously 3 years later on. He made his flat debut September 25, 1920, when unplaced at Tipperary Racecourse, which until 1986 was called Limerick Junction Racecourse. In October he was second at Limerick Racecourse, which shouldn't be confused with Limerick Junction Racecourse, and he was unplaced in his other flat run at Leopardstown in November. Morn had an outstanding debut season over jumps, winning 5 of his 7 races, including today's card. He was unplaced on his debut over jumps at Windsor on February 9th, and then was third at Leicester in March, with Mask Off unplaced on the same card but in a different race. He then won 5 races in a row. Only 4 days after that Leicester race he won a novice chase at Kempton. 2 days later he won at Folkestone, and later in March he won on this card we'll be looking at today on Hawthorn Hill. He won a novice hurdle at Newport in May, and in September he won at the former Mullingar Racecourse back in Ireland. January 2, 1922 he was unplaced at Baldoyle, another former Irish racecourse. It looks like it's another horse who got injured, as there's no sign of him running from January 1922 until April 1924, and in that April race he's second on flat at Down Royal in Northern Ireland. Long Down Patrick, both of these courses are actually ran by the Irish regulators, with horse racing being an all-Irish sport and the same as rugby union is. Moore was in place in his other 2 flat races that year. Moore won in only 1 chase that year, when victorious at Mullingar in May. Kildare Observer, as a correspondent, said it was an easy winner, and the journalist of the Dublin Sport was impressed by the training's performance in getting the horse back to his best. Clearly, he'd been out for a couple of years for injury, but he didn't race in future years. Marlian won this race, and he was owned, as I said earlier, by Colonel Croft. Colonel Croft also owned a winner of the Irish Cesarewitch, I already mentioned the Galway plate earlier on, and the Kildare Observer wrote after that win of the Irish Cesarewitch that Colonel Croft gave the whole prize money to the winning jockey Beasley. Again, Marlion is trained by Usher, who I assume is Harry Usher, and the jockey was James Hogan Jr., who won the 1923 Welsh Grand National. Marlion was declared a number of times on the flat in Ireland during 1916. It's a little tricky to get the results, and I'm not sure he won at any of these races, and as overnight declarances weren't in place yet, it can be a little difficult, especially first of all, and especially only having Irish declarances. I'm pretty sure I was still, for a few years, still part of Britain, but still rather tricky to get the results. He was declared in early June for a maiden hurdle at Leopardstown of a slightly odder distance of 1.5 miles. That month he was declared for a maiden hurdle and a flat plate in the same meeting at the former Mullingar course. In June and July he was declared a number of flat plates at Bellowstown, and July he was declared for plates at both Limerick and Limerick Junction racecourses as well as for Coa, Traymore, Galway 4 times during their Galway Festival, and at Roscommon. He was certainly unplaced in this Roscommon race on July the 30th and may actually be his debut. He was declared at Traymore again in August, and he did run at Mullingar at some point. I'm pretty sure he was unplaced. He was declared at the former Clare Morris and also Milltown Maybury racecourses, and again at Limerick. And he doesn't seem to have been about after this until November 1918, possibly due to injury and possibly because of World War I curtailing the calendar. But that month he was unplaced on Leopardstown of the Flat, and was second at a moderate plate of a Coa the same month. Reflex from Dublin Sports and Marlin's connections had some nice wages on him, so maybe some E-Tray money there. So it didn't say it was a disappointment for the connections. The term moderate for a race just disappeared finally really in the 1960s, but sometimes I feel it should return for some races we have nowadays. No, not through choice, I would say, but just renaming them as moderate races. He was declared at the former Logray racecourse again in Ireland, and in December he was second in a Mullingar hurdle. Reflex writing Dublin Sport later said he'd shown some aptitude over hurdles. He was unplaced in a maiden Leopardstown hurdle on Boxing Day. In 1919, Marlin did very well in his 3 flat races that year, winning in Ballinrobe in Ireland in September, second in Mullingar the same month, and then his final one was a win at Coa in November in another moderate plate. He then won at Mullingar over hurdles in March, and was second at Sligo in April. The Scotsman tipped in for Clare Morris's single meeting of the year in early July, but he was a non-runner. He won twice on the flat in 1920, winning the Galway Festival in August, and later in the month second at Traymore, which in those days was called Waterford and Traymore, which I think is still actually his official name. Reflex is fancying him for this race, as well as fancying him early in the year for a March hurdle at Leopardstown, but he was only 4th in it. In 1921 he won 7 times over jumps, what his last year of racing. He was placed twice but didn't win, and he was 4th at Leicester in February and 3rd at Sandon in March, and obviously he won on this card as well.